In California, a woman who fatally stabbed her boyfriend 108 times in 2018 after doing marijuana with him has just been sentenced to only 2 years of felony probation. So I have to ask, is this true justice in light of it being well known that California has a very liberal, soft on crime reputation? Or do the circumstances surrounding this incident justify this woman not having to serve time in prison for this man's brutal death? Well, let's talk about that. It was May 27th, 2018, when then 27-year-old Bryn Spetcher brutally stabbed her boyfriend, 26-year-old accountant Chad O'Melia, to death after they both smoked marijuana from a bong. She was tried in November of 2023, found guilty of involuntary manslaughter by a jury in December 2023, and sentenced to 2 years probation this January 2024. During the trial, the argument that her attorney made was that Bryn was an inexperienced pot smoker and became quote unquote involuntarily intoxicated at the time of the killing after Amelia pressured her to take a second hit from the bong because she didn't get high off the first hit. It was her reaction to this second intake of marijuana that was claimed to have caused her to have entered into a cannabis induced psychotic disorder, a reaction that resulted in her stabbing Chad O'Melia 108 times with 3 different knives. Now, the prosecutors did not dispute her psychotic reaction because upon the police arriving, she was noticeably in a state of hysteria. It was reported that on the next morning, officers arrived to find the victim lying in a pool of blood and the suspect screaming hysterically while holding a knife. According to the officers, when they tried to take the knife from her, she stabbed herself in the neck. The report states that the officers had to use a taser and several blows from a baton to eventually disarm her. But what the prosecution did do, though, is press that she chose to do the drugs and hence should be responsible for her actions while on the drugs. Something I believe most of us would think that the rule of law agrees with, as there are currently many people serving time in prison for crimes they committed while under the influence of drugs. Now, according to California state law, a person is considered responsible for their actions while under the influence of drugs or alcohol unless their intoxication is involuntary. And that was the argument upon which the defense mounted their case. They claimed that because Bryn was quote unquote pressured by her boyfriend to take the second hit from the bong, the pursuing psychoses that resulted in her stabbing him 108 times was not voluntary. They also argued that because she was not aware of how strong the marijuana she had agreed to take was, she could not have foreseen that it would trigger a psychotic episode. In the trial, it took the jury less than 4 hours to find her guilty of involuntary manslaughter, a verdict that had her facing up to 4 years in prison. However, the judge in his sentencing stated that as he took into consideration the fact that she had a good professional standing in the community, that she lacked any criminal history, and that she did in fact not know what she was doing due to the psychosis she was experiencing, he felt that punishment with imprisonment was not warranted, which is why he gave her only 2 years of felony probation and 100 hours of community service. Clearly, this was a tragic yet completely avoidable situation. And yes, both sides stipulated that her actions in brutally killing her boyfriend was indeed something that happened outside of her control because of the cannabis induced psychotic disorder that resulted from her smoking the marijuana. And so I completely agree with the verdict of involuntary manslaughter. But does that mean that she should be exempt from having to serve time in prison for this young man's death? After all, nothing that I saw in my research implied that this so called pressure she faced to smoke it a second time was in any way forceful. She apparently made her own choice to take that second dose of her own free will. Also, she apparently was not concerned about how strong the marijuana was because she did not ask about it before choosing to take it. So, with everyone being unarguably aware that taking drugs alters one's mind and that drugs can make us act in ways that we normally wouldn't, does the fact that she willingly chose to do the drug while fully knowing these things subject her legally to some measure of accountability for her actions, regardless of how severe a reaction she experienced? The prosecution held to the point that although she committed the murder while she was unable to understand what was happening due to the psychosis she was experiencing, she was yet still responsible for knowingly having made the choice to smoke more, which is what led to the psychosis that resulted in Chad O'Melia's death. And that is why they wanted prison time for her. But clearly, the judge had a different perspective. Now, I have to be honest in that although I am not by any means a person that buys into all this extreme rhetoric about racial injustice, I can't help but wonder what the outcome would have been if this wasn't a fairly cute white woman on trial. After all, what if this was a man who stabbed his girlfriend 108 times? Do you think that this judge would have given him the same judgment? And again, the point of this question is based upon the fact that there are many, many people in prison today who are there because they were held accountable for their actions in committing a crime while under the influence of drugs. If this current judgment of a person not being held accountable for actions committed while suffering the effects of drugs is indeed the rule of law, then these people serving time in prison now have a viable means for appeal in their convictions. In a statement delivered by Chad O'Melia's father, Sean, he said that the judge was biased and has now set a dangerous precedent. He says, quote unquote, he, referring to the judge, just gave everyone in the state of California who smokes marijuana a license to kill someone. Now, I am not an attorney, but although I believe that his statement is an extreme interpretation of the ruling, I would agree with him to the extent that at minimum, this judge's ruling has set the precedent for a valid legal defense in any criminal trial where the accused was under the influence of drugs. Also, I think that the issue of what defines pressure becomes a slippery slope for a judicial argument because what level of pressure becomes the legal excuse for criminal conduct? After all, in this case, the boyfriend did not put a gun to her head to take the marijuana. So, at what level of everyday, non physical, social pressure does a court rule a person can claim in their choice to involve themselves in conduct that led to a crime was involuntary? I must agree with Chad's father in that this sentence seems to be something that reeks of bias. I understand that the woman seemed genuinely remorseful over what happened, but genuine remorse is not an excuse to avoid accountability for criminal action. If, according to her own defense's argument that her boyfriend was pressuring her, she would have simply taken the responsibility to say no in spite of the pressure, this young man would not have been brutally murdered. So, what do you think about this ruling? Do you think that this is just another example of California being soft on crime? Or do you think that this woman received a judgment based on the judge's bias because she is a cute white woman? Do you think that a man or a non white person would have received the same sentence? To be honest, I think that in light of this ruling, there is ample reason to ask these questions. So let me know in the comments what your thoughts are. And if you like this type of content, please take the time to share this video with others as that would help me to grow my channel. I would also greatly appreciate it if you would hit that like button and subscribe to the channel because that will be a great help to me in continuing to put out this type of content. Hey, as always, I'd just like to say God bless you and thanks so much for taking the time to listen. Until next time.